Okay, so we're still in chapter one of our lecture. This is just the second part of the lecture. So now we're going to focus on the topics of what do artists do. So there are six functions essentially of what artists do, um, and how to kind of how everyone virtually contributes to art in some way, yet no matter how a society organizes itself, it calls on art makers to fulfill similar roles. So, what do artists do? They create places for some type of human purpose. Artists also create art that allows us to create extraordinary versions of ordinary objects. It allows us to record and commemorate. It gives tangible form to the unknown. It also gives a tangible form to both feelings and ideas, and it's refreshing of new vision and helps us to see the world in new ways. So moving on to the first concept of creating places for human purposes. So we originally talked about Stonehenge. Like I said, I would come back to that a little bit later on terms of the topic. So Stonehenge, the reason it was built, a lot of recent archaeologist research confirmed that the monument was marked as a graveyard and perhaps that of a ruling dynasty. And to me, it does kind of mimic that of a more modern or traditional cemetery that we would see now. And, in many days, way back in the days, many people obviously lived in the same, a lot of people stayed and lived in the same lands. They were around all their families and friends. And often when someone died, they would just essentially bury them in their backyard or around the land that they were currently living on and owned. So that idea of creating places for some human purpose. In comparison, we also look at these pyramids of Giza that were also designed as grave sites, and this use of purpose for use for humans. So art necessarily, this is the idea that art is functional, but they can also make it aesthetic, especially in terms of the pyramids. They are very aesthetic, but they're actually, functional as well. So aesthetically, from the outside, they would be visually appealing to passerbyers and to the people who were there creating them. But then they also had their sense of purpose by being constructed as a monument or a gravesite or some type of grave placement for their people. The next one is actually one of my favorites. This is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin. And if you really look at this image, if you've ever visited this site, this art site essentially, it was a very interesting concept. There's a lot of history in this. I really encourage you, if you have not visited, to visit it at some point, or if you have but you're not really sure about the history of it, especially the history of the artist herself, how she was chosen, how she came up with the idea. It's very powerful and impactful. But the purpose of this was, there was this long, very V-shaped wall of black granite. It was inscribed with the names of missing soldiers from the Vietnam War. She created this as a place for contemplation as well as remembrance. So this was a very painful memory for some. You enter from one walkway. It's kind of, like I said, it's a V shape. So you enter from one side and you kind of go downhill. And I think they mention this if you do some research, but it's like this idea of you're literally going underground. So these people are missing. So it's essentially like you're going into a grave, essentially, but obviously it's open and you're still out in the open. And then there's idea that you literally cut into the grass. So like they literally had to cut using this granite into the grass to create this artwork. So this idea of this pain and this intensity. The use of black granite, black is very solemn. There was also this idea of reflection. You can kind of see here the little bit of reflection here. And it's also just very kind of neutral. There's no color. There's nothing that could or could not make you feel one way or another. So like she said, it was made for contemplation as well as remembrance. So a lot of people will go and they'll take paper and they'll kind of etch over if once they find the name of their missing loved one that was never found. And that's their idea of remembrance. And then there's also contemplation. A lot of people like to go and just kind of, walk. It's a very quiet place if you've never been. People are not really talkative. It's very much like, obviously it's a memorial site, but people truly treat it like it's a grave site essentially. So this is located in Washington, D.C. You go down one way where the path, you kind of go down, and then the path point is at the highest here at the corner, and then you begin to ascend up the walkway here. So as with much of her work, the memorial's powerful form was a product of a long period of reading and thinking, and then followed by a moment of intuition. She said, I had a single impulse to cut into the earth. I imagined taking a knife and cutting into the earth, opening it up, an initial violence and pain that in time would heal. The grass would grow back, but the initial cut would remain a pure flat surface in the earth with a polished mirror surface, much like the surface of a geode when you cut in it and polish the edge. It would be a darker interface between our worlds and the quiet, darker, more peaceful world beyond. I never looked at the memorial as a wall or an object, but as an edge to the earth. It was the open side, pretty much allowing us, and that's that idea of reflection, allowing us to see from that idea, even going, this is, even back to influence from other arts, that idea of primitive art, of that connection between the earthly realm where we're currently at and an idea of that heavenly, divine, or spiritual realm on the other side. So it's this idea, there's like a two-way mirror, almost like you're looking at yourself. Eventually we're all going to die at some point, and it's that idea of just like contemplating life. These people are missing, their bodies were never found, and remembering those times. So as we kind of go through, you can kind of see different viewpoints. This is how you would enter one side, and then you would walk. People will leave flowers, notes, and things along the edges. But it's very clean. It's very simple design here. But I think it has such a powerful meaning behind it. And here's it when it's snowed, and then that's the way you would walk up and out the other side. And you can see the reflection here as well. Okay, so now we're going to go to the second point that artists perform, and that's to create extraordinary versions of ordinary objects. So we looked at some vessels and things earlier. They were very extraordinary garments, things like textiles, things like buildings and things like that. So these adornments on vessels, buildings brought out the very extraordinary components of the items created by the artist. Once again, we talk about the idea of function. If this building did not have all these decorations and these adornments, would we think they are as appealing? Would we think they're functional? Would we think they're as important? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But this idea of taking these ordinary objects, so if this was plain, we might just be like, okay, it's another vessel, it's another pottery, it's another vase, etc., etc. But the adornment and the graphics and the designs that were placed on here make it much more interesting, and once again create those extraordinary versions of those ordinary objects. The third important task for artists to remember is to record and commemorate. So the idea is that artists create images that help us remember the present after it has slipped into the past. Essentially that keep us in mind of our history, and that will speak to our times of the future. So this is almost like, art was created, they did not have cameras and things like that we do now to be able to snapshot, current moments, and we can just store them on our phone or in a file, or even print them out and put them in a frame and remember those memories. A lot of times memories had to be painted to have that record of that documentation, and to also commemorate these important events throughout history. So if we look at the image on the left here, this is a heroic portrait by Jacques Louis David that commemorates the military and the emperor's achievements. And you can tell by the use of the horse elevated on its hind legs, the stature of the figure on the horse has a very, the idea of red is very powerful. So here we kind of see that idea of that heroic portrait and these achievements. So that's that idea of recording and commemorating those is historic events. And then to the right over here, we have the 3rd of May, which was created by Francisco Goya. And this shows the resistance of the Napoleon army during the Peninsula War. We see a very intense, it's very gory, but, had we not had these images portrayed by these artists, we maybe would not understand what had happened, or maybe we wouldn't have as, if maybe there was somebody who wrote about it instead of seeing a visual image, we may or may not get as much feeling from it if we just read about it in an article, or if we were just reading a paper versus actually seeing an image of, a figure with their arms up and they're kind of like, no, showing that resistance and kind of showing that visual impact that art can have. Moving on to the 4th topic. So a 4th task for artists is to give tangible form to the unknown, essentially portraying what cannot be seen with the eyes, or events that can only be imagined. So there was a sculptor of the 10th century that gave tangible form to the Hindu god Shiva in the Nataraja, Lord of the Dance, which is this image here. You see that the image is encircled by flames, the long hair flying outward. Shiva dances the destruction and rebirth of the world, the end of one cycle, um, which is this figure right here around it. Oops, excuse me, went too fast. Um, and the beginning of another. The figure's forearms communicate the complexity of the cosmic moment. In one hand, Shiva holds the small drum, whose beat summons up creation, and in the other, the Shiva holds the flame of destruction. A third hand is pointed at the raised foot, beneath which worshippers may seek refuge, and the fourth hand is raised with its palm towards the viewer, a gesture that means fear not. So this was idea of giving when we understand the historical concept, we may look at this and be like, okay, it's a sculpture, it's not moving, so how is this giving tangible form to the unknown? But with this, once we learn the historical components of the artwork, once we understand the context, once we understand what is being portrayed in the artwork, then we are able to understand, how that tangible form is given and why it's given, and why it's important to that specific culture or society. Okay, so number 5 is to give tangible forms to both feelings and ideas. So when you looked at the Shiva, we were giving tangible forms to ideas, in terms of the religious culture of Hinduism. Here we have The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, and then we have The Scream by Edvard Munch. So Starry Night, Vincent van Gogh was labored to express his personal feelings. He was in the outskirts of a small village in France, looked up at the night sky. He became intrigued by the belief that people journey to a star after their death, and then they continued their lives. Just as the train to get to Tarascon or Rouen, he wrote in a letter, "We take death to reach a star." So it's this idea that inspired him to create this landscape here. And I also think this idea of, he has these very wispy uses of impressionist kind of style in the mark making that he used in his images. Gives a very definite feeling as to what he was feeling, but also maybe how he would want his audience and his viewers to portray those feelings as well. So I think that makes it very interesting. And then Edvard Munch, in comparison to the right, you have this very lonely figure. The face is kind of gender neutral, and we just kind of look, and the background seems very warm. It's kind of a mix of warm and cool colors, and we kind of have it has a very swirled effect. And so I feel like our eye continues to keep moving. Even same thing here with Van Gogh. Our eye just continues to move throughout. So maybe we're not really sure what we feel by looking at it, but maybe we feel a sense of being overwhelmed. But it does give us a lot of ideas. This person is being abandoned. They've been left. They're kind of over in the dark, So there is a way that artwork can give these tangible forms to both feelings and ideas. The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali is another big one. This feeling of being restricted, things that don't make sense. Obviously, this idea of an oasis, this half cut out face here. We've got the lashes. We've got these clocks melting. We've got this tree growing out of a cement block, which obviously would be completely unnatural. And then you've kind of got this oasis here. Obviously that would not be normal or not be considered possible in a desert of some sort. So once again, that idea of giving those tangible forms to feelings and ideas, and maybe allowing ourselves to interpret those concepts as well on our own. So maybe one person looks at it and they see one thing, and then maybe another individual looks at a different concept and they see it differently. Number 6, actually, is the refreshing of our vision and helping us to see the world in a new way. So this image and the second image here is part of Doris Salcedo's Shibboleth, created in 2007 2008. This was an installation piece. This was a very interesting piece. It's the idea of seeing through someone else's eyes. And the idea you can see kind of here in the image, this crack. It was not, when things crack, they don't always make these nice, perfectly straight lines. The work is in reference specifically to the immigrant experience in Europe. It was commissioned by the Tate Museum in London. It comes from the biblical story in which a community uses the word Shibboleth to determine who belonged and who did not. When you look at the huge crack, visitors are forced to pay attention to the most mundane part of the environment, which is the floor. The crack also, when you look at it, you actually kind of manipulate yourself, because sometimes you look at it and it's kind of a shallow part of a crack. And then when you look down the other side, it's actually very deeply cut. And then there's kind of like a chicken wire, barbed wire, essentially, that separates and kind of holds the sides up. And that's also that idea of, who belongs in and who belongs on the outside. This was also very interesting because once this piece was completed, they obviously, it was an installation piece, so they had to go back and cover the flooring and fill it in. But there was this idea of a scar that was left. And that was part of the artist's motivation for helping us see the world in new ways. That just because you cover up the scar doesn't mean that the history is not there, doesn't mean that the pain is not still there. So I think that's very refreshing in how artists can take these concepts and literally take them to the next level. And we may not even interpret them or understand them as the viewers, even if we're artists ourselves, but how they can be interpreted in that manner. So I think that's very interesting. So once again, what do artists do? Like we talked about, they create places for human purposes. They create extraordinary versions of ordinary objects. They use art to record and commemorate. And they give tangible form to the unknown. They give tangible form to feelings. And they also help to refresh our vision in seeing the world in new ways. So the next part of this chapter is creating and creativity. So once again, just kind of think about these questions, maybe jot them down on a piece of paper, maybe write them in your phone. What exactly is creativity? Are we born with it? Can it be learned? But can it also be lost? Are artists more creative than other people? And if so, how did they get that way? By definition, creativity has broadly been defined as the ability to produce something that is both innovative and useful within a given social context. So to me, creativity is anything. It is, whether you're an artist or not. Are we born with it? One of my favorite quotes is from Pablo Picasso. It says, all children are born artists. The idea is how to remain an artist once they grow up. So I think we all are born with this sense of art and creativity in our minds. But a lot of times, we either get shut down because somebody tells us that what we create is not art, or that what we create is not essentially creative or good enough. And then I think people begin to shut down. So I do think we're all born with it. I think some of us just have a little bit more of an impulse and we want to take a little bit farther in terms of either art education, art history, art appreciation, etc. Can it be learned? I do think so. I think art, I don't know that it can necessarily be learned, but I think it can be influential. I think you can be influenced by people you surround yourself with, especially if they are very creative individuals in whatever manner it may be. Can it be lost? I absolutely think that creating and creativity can be lost. I myself have realized that, when I'm not like in school, or I'm always, especially as an art instructor, teacher, etc., I'm always kind of in a studio environment setting. And when I'm not there, I definitely kind of lose. It's not that I necessarily lose my creativity, but I kind of maybe lose the urge. Like, I'm inspired by, maybe a student says something or they draw something. I'm like, oh, that reminded me of XYZ. So then I create something. Not that I can't necessarily do that when I'm alone. But I do think when you surround yourself in an environment, it doesn't necessarily have to be with people, but of an environment, I think you can help to keep that creativity intact, which is important. I do not think artists are more creative than other people. I just think they're more bold and they want to put their creativity out there. A lot of people are very creative, but they don't want to share that with the world in fear of being rejected. Or maybe they just don't have the resources and opportunities to be able to present their creativity. So maybe it's just a lack of resources or tools or networking or knowing a person who knows a person who knows a person. So I think it's just their boldness. I think they're just willing to take that next step, and they may or may not care what people think, but they're willing to get out there and put their name and their word and their creativity out there. So this work I think is very interesting. It's on page 13 in your text. This is the studies of gentian moth, birds, cats, an interlacing motif. Rarely when we look at work of art, we are always looking to see the results of a creative process. But we really have access to the process itself. So I think I mentioned that earlier, the idea of process over product. And I think kids are big with this, especially very young kids like pre-K, kindergarten, elementary school level. They go through the process and they're not really worried about the final product. I think a lot of time, especially older students, especially when you get to the high school level, and even as you move into college, even if you're an art major, even if you're not an art major and you just like doodling or creating art, you're always thinking about that end process, and you're not willing to have the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, 20 pages of sketches or ideas or brainstorming concepts to look back on. You just are like, okay, I want to draw this, I want to do this, I want to be done, this is what I want it to look like, or this is what it should look like. And you're not willing to go through the sketches and the process. And I think that's where creativity is inhibited. I think that those sketches sometimes become influential to our final product because we allow ourselves to go through those processes. So I think this is very, very interesting. This kind of sketchbook, belonged to this Italian artist, Giorgio di Giovanni. Just this is a very detailed sketch, actually. Some of the sketches don't even have to be this detailed to be able to understand process over product. But I do think that's an important part of both creativity and creation in general. This artwork as well, this is by Mike Kelly, The Candor's Full Set. This is a cast resin, blown glass, and in illuminated pedestals. So this artist would sometimes leave behind a text that kind of relates to how the work, how we see the form of it. Through it, we can witness kind of the creative process in action. Excuse me. Candor is a place where Superman, the comic book hero, was born in the Superman story. A little bit of background history on this. We learn that Krypton was destroyed. Candor, however, was miniaturized and stolen before the disaster, and it eventually ended up in Superman's possession and keeps it under a glass bell jar in his Fortress of Solitude. So this artist here, we can see the many traits of creative work in the narrative of the project here. The leap of imagination, the flexibility to respond to setbacks by generating new ideas. But I also think that, like we said, the profession of artist is not the only one that requires creativity. Scientists, mathematicians, teachers, business executive, doctors, librarians, computer programmers, people in every line of work, if they, look for ways to be creative, they can. Artists maybe do more of a visual creativity, but other people are as well. We think about ads on TV, we think about products we buy. Somebody had to make those. That was a creativity. Maybe they come up with a slogan. Maybe they come up with an ad. Maybe they come up with a, not a bulletin board, oh my gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. The boards that they have when you're driving, I'll think of it in a minute. But, somebody had to be creative in coming up with that image or that saying or that phrase or that logo or something. And that doesn't necessarily always have to be an artist. That can be a business executive. That can be a scientist. They come up with these creative process just like artists as well. It just may be interpreted in a different fashion and maybe relate differently. All right, so the last part of chapter 1 is looking and responding. So by definition, science tells us that seeing is a mode of perception, essentially the recognition and interpretation of sensory data. And it is how information comes into our eyes and what we make of it. It is a highly subjective matter as to how we perceive and understand visual information. So I think I briefly talked on this as well. Two people can look at the same composition, same work of art, and they could see totally different things based off, they could be off their background, it could be off how they were raised with their childhood, it could be their childhood experiences or experiences or things they did not experience during childhood. So looking and responding is a big part of what is art and the creation of art and creativity. So if you look at this image here, this is a poster titled Public that was designed in 2012. And if you look deeply at it, the first thing, I don't want to give it away too much, but hopefully you've looked at it long enough before I say this. Did you see the bike first or did you see the word public first? I'm going to let you think about that for just a minute, because a lot of people were like, oh, I definitely saw the image of the bike first because that is how their brain is programmed. Excuse me. But then other people were like, no, I totally saw the words first, and then I realized that it was made into the idea of a bicycle. So that's that idea of looking and responding, how our brain interprets things. Like it said, this idea of how the information comes into our eyes and then what we make of it. So two people looking at the exact same image could have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different interpretations, and none of them are necessarily wrong. It's just the way that we look and respond to the work, or how we interpret it, or how it makes us feel versus how it makes, like, somebody might look at this and they might be like, this isn't art, this is basic, this is simple. And somebody could be like, wow, I cannot believe they took the word public and designed it into this bike form. It's an interpretation and a subjectivity thing as well. As we look for these last two as well, this is called Vanitas by Valdez Leal. Excuse me. And this reveals kind of a careless jumble of objects with a cherub looking over them. We see this man looking out at us from the background in the shadow, but what are the objects? What are the cherub and the man doing? But it's here with the idea of looking and responding that only if we begin to ask and answer such questions does the message of the painting begin to emerge. When we ask, when we look, when we think, if we just walk by this and we're like, I'm not really sure. But when you start to study it, especially if you understand how to study art, how to look at it, how to respond to it, you start to understand the context of what the artist is wanting you to feel or understand as well. And I think that's very interesting. And then the last artwork is by Audrey Flock, The Wheel of Fortune. Once again, this artwork as well. She was fascinated with the traditions of the Vanitas here, and that's kind of something that the artist built on. This kind of, almost like she was creating an updated version of this, kind of modernizing. So even though she may be painting with one eye on the past, the other is firmly on the society is now. She used things like, a photograph. She used a tube of lipstick. She used sun symbols that no longer speak to us directly. But she's also, despite the differences between the last two images here, it provides us with many clues to direct our thoughts, and kind of this idea, of what exactly, how do we interpret that art? So the most important thing is that some works of art come to mean something for you and for your own experiences, thoughts, and emotions. So find that place and allow them to be used in you, and let yourself allow yourself to enjoy the art and interpret that. So that's the end of the first chapter lecture. Hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have questions or need me to go over anything else, just let me know.